Module 33 will review with us the different ideas of inflation, disinflation, and deflation, and we're going to build from there. We're going to learn about mild, moderate, and hyperinflation and seeing what causes each of those situations and some actual economies that have been impacted by the different levels of inflation. We'll talk about how inflation looks on an 80AS model, as well as stagflation. And we'll get a little bit more detail about disinflation and deflation, the inflation tax, and how it functions in our country. Inflation can be mild, moderate, or severe, which we often call hyperinflation. Mild inflation is the goal. We think of that as price stability. In America, we expect prices to go up a little bit each year, but as long as they're only going up a small amount, say between 1% and 3%, people can afford that price increase without it really impacting their lives very much. So we're okay with that level of mild inflation. Moderate inflation is more, so you can see that's approximately 13% a year. Now that would become more of a factor, and people might not buy as many goods, or they might not buy expensive items if they had such a big price increase. This is often seen on the business cycle. If we're at the top of a recovery or expansion period, almost towards the peak, that's when you're going to find higher levels like moderate inflation. The next type, hyperinflation, is not a typical thing. We have not experienced that level of high inflation in America, so we won't see that one at the peak. Moderate is more common at the peak of a business cycle. The highest level of inflation is hyperinflation, and this is not common, thankfully. This can go along with really rapid increases in the money supply. Usually this goes along with maybe corruption in the government, or a government that is so desperate that it's printing really large amounts of currency to cover debts. So two of the biggest examples of hyperinflation, a modern example would be Zimbabwe, where they were experiencing inflation at the rate of 11 million% per year. So the leaders of Zimbabwe were trying to buy out a lot of the farmland. They wanted to nationalize that system and have it be controlled and taken over by the government instead of individually controlled by farmers. They printed huge amounts of currency in order to buy out those farmers, which of course means that the payment that they received would become worth a lot less. When there is so much more of your currency, the value or the purchasing power of it falls. So everybody needed more money. So this picture that every Zimbabwean is a millionaire is a joke, of course, because they weren't actually getting paid more. Everything actually just cost that much more. In order to get out of this situation, a lot of the people started bartering or switching to other currencies like the US dollar, and eventually they had to get rid of their currency completely. Another historic example would be post-World War I Germany. So Germany was on the losing side of things. They were ordered to pay reparations to the winning side. So they had to pay huge amounts of money to make up for the damage that had been done to other countries. So you can see here the rate of inflation. They started printing huge amounts of their currency, the mark, in order to pay off these reparation debts. For that reason, in 1914, at the onset of World War I, one US dollar would buy 4.2 German marks. But with this crazy high hyperinflation that occurred afterwards, by 1923, one US dollar bought 4.2 trillion German marks. So you can see how little each individual German mark became worth. So people started using that currency as wallpaper. They were burning it for fuel. It was very meaningless in each individual dollar. This led to the Germans as well getting rid of their currency and replacing it for a different one. And they also renegotiated the terms of the reparation, because a lot of people realized that extreme economic conditions like hyperinflation can create really unstable countries. And this is credited for one of the reasons why Hitler was able to rise to power. When the economy is that messed up and all of your life savings becomes that meaningless, people are willing to accept a lot of things and blame people they might not have before. So nowadays we realize that if we see economic instability at this scale, a lot of times world banks and other international groups, the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, will step in to try to prevent things at this scale. Classical model is something that is the way that economists used to look at our economy prior to the Great Depression. Classical implies it's this traditional way of looking at things. Now, the classical model, the key thing for you to know is that only the long run matters. We'll learn a lot more about classical model and compare it to Keynesian model in Module 35. But for now, as long as you get that only the long run matters and that the classical economists would completely ignore short run problems, that's key. Now, this applies to money and prices. So think about money in the long run. We've learned that money is neutral in the long run. In other words, if you print more money, or if you just decrease the money supply, it will change the nominal interest rate in the short run, but in the long run, the nominal interest rate will return to the original point. Therefore, classical economists wouldn't care about that short run change because they know it's going to go back to where it started anyway. Prices are on the ADAS model, and we know that recessionary and inflationary gaps do self-correct in the long run. SRAS moves back. There will be a long-run effect on prices, though. There will be either inflation or deflation. But the classical economists would say there's no point in worrying about that recession or that inflationary gap because it's going to self-correct in the long run as well. To see why classical economists feel the way they do about only focusing on the long run and completely ignoring short run effects, let's see why that's true and what happens to money and the ADAS model in the long run. So first of all, we're seeing that in the long run, a change in money supply, which is M because the quantity of money supply down here is M, leads to an equivalent change in the aggregate price level, or P. That will leave the real quantity of money at its original level. Now, we have not talked about real quantity of money. That's a new concept, so we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's walk through these shifts. So if MS is increasing 5%, I'm not going to perfectly label everything because with these video recordings, it's very hard to actually show every single thing, but I'll do a 2 just so we can see that money supply increased, which makes interest rates fall. When interest rates fall, investment spending goes up. That's going to make AD go to the right. Increasing price level and increasing real GDP in the short run. Because we only have one shift on each model, one shift is a short run impact. Now, we've also learned with this law of money neutrality that however much money supply increases, prices increase the same amount. So if there is more money, you have 5% more money, but everything costs 5% more, the purchasing power, the value of those individual dollars isn't actually affected. And that's this whole idea that the purchasing power of the money isn't affected in the long run. Now let's go ahead and finishing our long run effects on the model. If APL goes up, everything costs more, you're going to need more dollars to pay for things. So money demand will go up, and that returns our nominal interest rate to where we started. So the nominal interest rate has no effect in the long run. In the long run, we can see that our E2 on the ADAS model is giving us an inflationary gap, so unemployment is going to be low. If unemployment is low, there's very few people looking for jobs. So firms will have to raise wages to encourage a quality employee. If wages go up, nominal wages, that shifts SRAS left, and that self-corrects this model to the long run. We do have higher prices, but real GDP goes back to where it starts. So aggregate demand went back and real GDP went back. Now let's get into this concept of the real quantity of money. In the long run, the quantity of money did get bigger, right, from our E1 to our E3. And in the long run, the price level did get higher. Those two things did not self-correct. Nominal interest rate self-corrected and real GDP self-corrected. But if there is more money and everything costs more, now we have our M, quantity of money, divided by our P, change in price level, tells us that if we adjust the quantity of money for the change in prices, the real quantity of money in terms of, well, I need more money to pay for things that cost more, returns to normal. So at the end of the day, in the long run, classical economists would say that these short-run changes are completely insignificant, not worth paying attention to, because things are going to go back to where they should in the long run. Because the classical model really only cares about long run, they assume that the real quantity of money, which is that adjusted quantity of money, is always at the long run equilibrium level, and they're going to ignore any short run changes in money supply. The classical model is accurate during high inflation, but it's not very accurate during periods of low inflation. So we're going to go back through both scenarios and see why it works well when inflation is high and why it does not during low inflation. So we'll explain that. Here you can see the model where, because classical model only cares about long run, there is no SRAS, short run aggregate supply curve. They would ignore that completely. So they only have the vertical, which we would label long run, LRAS, and aggregate demand. They're going to ignore any gaps because you won't see gaps when the only options are AD moving up and down in the long run. First, let's go through why low levels of inflation or relative price stability will not work well with the classical model. So in that situation, if prices are rising slowly, it can take a long time for people in the economy, workers and firms, to react to that change. So let's say we're in a price stable environment and we have maybe 3% increase in prices. If everything costs you 3% more, people don't tend to be eager to demand a raise. And businesses might not necessarily want to go through the cost it takes to reprint their menus and to redo all of the price stickers on their items for low levels of inflation. So because some of those prices are sticky in the short run, remember, sticky means slow to change, there will be a shift in SRAS, but it will happen slowly. We learned that if there's an inflationary gap, that's going to lead to unemployment going up and prices and wages should rise. But if it takes a while for that to occur, there will be a delay in firms responding by shifting SRAS, by changing their supply. So eventually, maybe after a couple of years of 3% the first year, then 3% the second year, eventually there will be this reaction, and SRAS will self-correct in the model. But the lower the inflation, the longer it can take. And so that gap, that inflationary gap, if it lasts years, it's hard to say that it doesn't exist at all. So the classical model that completely would ignore that short-run problem is not very accurate with low inflation. During high inflation, the classical model is much more effective. If prices were going up at a much higher rate, let's say 20 or 30% a year, now all of a sudden wages and prices will not be as sticky. If you noticed that everything is costing you 30% more, you're going to be pretty quick to ask your boss for a raise. And businesses also know that if 30% price increase is going to cut into their profit margin pretty heavily, because very few businesses make 30% profit. So they're also going to raise their prices very quickly. So the higher the inflation level, the faster both workers and businesses respond to the inflation rate by raising the price of my labor, my wage, or the sales price of final products. When workers and firms raise prices, that means commodity prices are going to go up, and that's something that shifts SRAS left. When nominal wages go up, that also shifts SRAS left. So the faster those prices rise, the faster SRAS shifts. So the self-correction will be rapid back to the LRAS, back to the long-run equilibrium point when we have high inflation. So there will be that inflationary gap that classical economists are ignoring, that's a short-run problem, but it will be much briefer. It won't last as long during high inflation. And that's why the classical model does show us overall what's happening fairly well during high inflation, because that short-run gap doesn't last very long. Zimbabwe is a great example of hyperinflation to show us how classical model is effective in showing the impact of a change on money supply on inflation rate. Now remember, the Consumer Price Index is a measure of the market basket that families pay for goods they buy on a regular basis. It is one way of calculating inflation rate. Now, Zimbabwe is absolutely an example of high inflation. And unlike post-World War I Germany, because it happened more recently, we have really excellent data, so that's easier to graph what happened in Zimbabwe. And we can see when money supply is increasing, the Consumer Price Index is increasing right along with it. The changes are much closer and much more similarly linked. So classical economists that might ignore the delay between, okay, we print more money and eventually prices rise, they don't have to wait so long in high inflation, and these are much more closely linked than they would be in a place with lower inflation. Inflation tax is the concept that if a government prints money and they print too much money, it can create inflation. Now, the cost of that inflation ends up being people have to pay more for goods and the value of their individual dollars goes down. And that cost normally ends up falling on citizens and households and consumers in the economy. In the past, various people in the media have accused people in the US government for printing money in order to pay down their deficits. But let's think about what we know. Who is in charge of printing money? Does the government control it? What is their relationship? How much power do they actually have? Our question is, how can the U.S. government be accused of printing money to pay off deficits or the debt, since the Federal Reserve is in charge of issuing or printing money, not the U.S. Treasury? So what does the U.S. Treasury have power over? The Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve do work together. The Treasury Department is directly under government control. The Federal Reserve is not. The Treasury Department issues debt. So if the government does have a high deficit and they want to borrow money to make up for it, one of the ways they can borrow money is by selling Treasury bonds. Bonds are loans, and if the Federal Reserve buys these bonds, or remember if commercial banks buy these bonds, that is a way that the federal government gets somebody to give them money for a set length of time to finance the government spending to make up for the deficit. So if the government would like someone to help loan them money, they issue Treasury bonds, also called government securities, through the Treasury Department. If the Federal Reserve decides that they would like to increase the money supply, the Fed can print more money. They can use that money to buy Treasury bonds through open market operations. Remember, this is the Fed buying and selling Treasury bonds from commercial banks. So if they decided to buy bonds from commercial banks, they would put excess reserves that they had printed when they printed more money into those banks' accounts. Whoever's holding on to the Treasury bonds when they mature earns interest. So if the Federal Reserve is holding on to these Treasury bonds, the Treasury Department has to pay them interest. And this is why T-bonds, Treasury bonds, are only liabilities for the Treasury Department and nobody else. Even the Federal Reserve would consider a Treasury bond to be an asset. So anyway, the Federal Reserve, if they're holding on to these T-bonds, they earn interest. But since the Federal Reserve is not for profit, they can use any interest that they earn to pay operating expenses, pay for their employees, any costs they have for electricity of their 12 regional banks, all of those things. But at the end of the year, if they have any extra money that they don't need for those expenses, they must return all the extra interest payments to the Treasury Department. So this is a great deal for the government. They get somebody to buy their debt through the form of T-bonds, and if the Federal Reserve gets paid too much in 1 year, the government gets some of that money back. Now, they can't make the Federal Reserve decide to buy these T-bonds. The Fed chair only does this if they think it's what's necessary in the economy. But if the Fed does buy the T-bonds, it's definitely a good deal for our federal government. So the truth of the matter is that the government can't print money to pay off debts. Not so simple. But they have given the Federal Reserve the right to print money if they so choose. And the Federal Reserve often uses the money that they print to pay off government debt. If the Federal Reserve has a lot of Treasury bonds and they have extra interest at the end of the year, the government is actually able to earn money off of the Federal Reserve. So the government has been able to pay off billions of dollars of debt through the Federal Reserve printing money. So this separation has actually been beneficial for the government. Seigniorage is a word that originated during feudalism in the Middle Ages, where people that were allowed to print money were able to generate a little bit of money every time they printed some. And so our nation, even though it, in a sense, outsourced money printing to the Federal Reserve, they still profit off of the right to print money, even though somebody else has that right, the Federal Reserve. Before we wrap up this concept of inflation tax and how inflation hurts consumers and households within a nation, let's review why printing money leads to inflation. So if the Federal Reserve decided to print more money, money supply will increase. That will lead to interest rates falling. When interest rates fall, investment spending is going to go up. Investment spending is part of GDP, remember SIG-XM, and all of those things are types of spending that increase aggregate demand. It would shift it to the right. So money supply went up. That led to the price level going up, which is inflation. So when more money is printed, either by the government directly in some places or in America by the Federal Reserve, inflation leads to a decline in the purchasing power of money. When everything costs more, your individual dollar buys less. And that becomes an unofficial inflation tax. So imagine it as inflation tax in little air quotes, because no one in Congress is actually passing a law to raise an inflation tax. But the idea is that if everything you buy costs you more because of some sort of government action, that's why it's an unofficial inflation tax. Here in this image, we can see that potatoes went from 32 cents to $1.30, a 306% change. So each of these items, if you look at the right column, we can see the percent that they went up. So those things function like a tax. If everything costs more, it's almost like the government saying, we're going to add this extra, in this case, 70 cents or 70% onto everything of every dozen eggs you buy. We're going to add a 41% tax to every 5 pounds of sugar you buy. Well, that's expensive. And even though the government benefits by this extra money because they're able to use it to pay off their debt, the people in the country who are paying these higher prices are the ones that are hurt. That's what this concept of inflation tax means. A 7% inflation rate economy-wide would function for households across the country, just the same as a 7% tax on all goods and services. So when the government prints money directly or has the Federal Reserve print money for them to pay their debts, if money is printed for the sole purpose of paying off the government's debt, the citizens of the nations are the ones who suffer. Hyperinflation is the extreme cases of inflation. We're talking about 1,000% increase a year, not 10%. So hyperinflation gets out of control when the government usually prints a huge amount of money. The quantity of money they print creates this inflation tax for their people. And they're, of course, doing it to cover the deficit. So the beginning of hyperinflation sounds like normal inflation to a larger extent. Even though the inflation had a very normal beginning, hyperinflation normally is caused by an inflationary spiral. Things start to spiral out of control. So it starts off with the government printing money to pay off debts, creating inflation. Very typical. But when they're printing huge amounts of money, that's going to affect the purchasing power of the money. And the people in the nation are realizing that, hey, the individual value of my currency is going down. So maybe I don't want as much of this currency if it's becoming worth less, and they can start bartering instead. They can figure out other currencies to use. They use their currency less when it becomes worth less. It makes sense, but the difference is when perception gets involved. When the public changes their behavior based on the inflation, that's when this inflationary spiral begins. The problem is we have a fiat currency, and most currencies around the world are the same way, meaning that the value of the currency isn't tied to a commodity anymore. It's not tied to a specific good. So in fiat currencies, supply and demand of the currency affects the value of the currency. How much can that currency buy? When the people stop using or using the currency less, that's going to reduce the demand for the currency. And as we know, supply and demand of anything, if the demand goes down, the price falls. So in this case, the reduced demand for money hurts the value, the price, the purchasing power even more. The act of people not trusting their currency because the value went down makes the value go down even further. And we are not done with this inflationary spiral. When the public decreased their demand for the currency, it has the effect of lowering the purchasing power of the currency. Now, this was all started because the government is trying to use the money to pay off their debt. If during the process of paying off the debt, the value of that currency goes down, they're going to have to print even more money to pay off the current debt. Because let's say we owed China money. We tend to do that. They convert our dollar into the Chinese currency called the yuan. And the inflation rate in our country affects the exchange rate. So as bills are being paid, if the purchasing power of the dollar that you use to pay the bills changes, you'll need more money to exchange for that currency to pay off the debt. So the decrease in purchasing power means government has to print even more money, which of course makes the public even more uncomfortable using their currency because they know their money is worth even less, which decreases the purchasing power further, so the government has to print even more money, and so on and so on and so on. And that's our inflationary spiral. So that's how normal rates of inflation can become hyperinflation. It's a combination of way too much printing to begin with, as well as the public changing their spending behavior and deciding to use their own currency less. Moderate inflation can be seen in two different ways in the ADAS model. Basically, all we need for it to be inflation is for the aggregate price level to go up. And that can happen either if SRAS shifts left or if AD shifts right. Both of those two things would make the price level go up and create inflation. We're going to have two terms for this: cost push and demand pull. Demand pull obviously refers to the change in aggregate demand. Cost push, cost motivates producers to decrease their supply, so that's going to be the SRAS shift. The first type of inflation on the ADAS model is cost push inflation. This is when the price of an economy-wide resource, like a commodity, would go up, or nominal wages would go up, something that is such a big deal in the economy that the increase in this cost would push producers to decrease their supply, making it shift left. Oil, for example, is an extremely important commodity. It's used in businesses all over the country. So if oil prices went up, that would create a major decrease in SRAS. When SRAS shifts to the left, that creates inflation. Cost push inflation when SRAS shifts left not only creates inflation, it creates the worst possible kind, stagflation. We've seen this before. Stagflation is when real GDP, or output in the economy, is not growing, it's stagnant. So when real GDP declines, we don't have growth, but we have inflation. The price level is rising. So stagnant growth plus prices rising equals stagflation. You will need to draw cost push inflation on the next page, so go ahead and turn the notes. This is mostly labeled correctly. You could label it price level or APL. That's fine either way. Real output we've done as real GDP. Some textbooks refer to YP, potential output, as output at full employment. That's what that FE is. It's the same thing, but just for the sake of consistency and what we're used to, that would be YP for us. And then YE because it lines up with our E1. When SRAS shifts to the left, we have an E2 and a YE2. And we can see the true stagflation because output went down to the left here and prices went up. So pause if you need more time to fully label this model. The other type of inflation is called demand pull inflation. And this is caused when AD shifts to the right. So demand, when it goes up, it pulls prices up with it. So if we have large amounts of demand, people are buying more than they were before. This can sometimes happen when consumers anticipate inflation. They think that things are going to cost more in the future. And if you think things will cost more later, this motivates you to buy things now, before this price change occurs. The ironic part is that if everybody assumes prices will go up, so they go out and go shopping, That rise in demand creates inflation, which makes prices go up. This also sometimes goes along with economic growth, where there are more products being produced and that can create more demand. If people are earning more money, wages are higher, that can lead to, and more jobs are existing and being formed, that also can lead to people buying more stuff. Demand pull inflation could also be caused by expansionary fiscal policy. Since fiscal policy shifts AD, and expansionary tells you that it increased. Monetary policy, especially expansionary monetary policy, could also lead to demand pull inflation, because if monetary policy goes up, interest rates go down, so investment spending goes up, and that shifts AD right. So fiscal policy directly shifts AD, monetary policy leads to interest rates changing, and that creates an effect that will shift AD. So fiscal policy, we said, if it's expansionary, can lead to demand pull inflation. And this often goes along with election cycles. Politicians, during their campaigns, often will promise to cut taxes, just because it's something that people universally tend to like to hear. Now, the problem is, if the economy is near full employment, at that point, if you cut taxes, that's going to shift AD to the right, which can create inflation. There will be a delay in this inflation, but it still occurs. So occasionally there's something called the political business cycle, and that shows little increases in price levels around elections when people make these campaign promises. So again, when you're labeling this model, we want to make sure that we're drawing everything properly. We have our YP and our YE because we're starting on the long run at full employment, and that's going to give us E1. When the demand pull inflation occurs, AD shifts right. So E2 is up here to the side, and then YE2. Now, we did have inflation, and inflation is never a good thing. Prices went up. But demand pull inflation is better than cost push inflation because at least output went up as well as prices. So this is preferable to stagflation for sure. As we know, deflation is a decline in the overall price level. This is when prices economy-wide start to fall. If everything in your economy is cheaper, that means the value or purchasing power of your money goes up because $1 can buy more when everything is cheaper. It also affects the value of assets. So things that you already own, like homes, stocks, businesses, maybe a valuable car, things like that, their values fall. Because when prices fall, that also affects things that you're not buying, but you're currently holding on to. So the value of those assets can go down. A lot of times people think that deflation is a great thing because, yay, everything's cheaper. But that's not true. Not only does deflation lead to a decline in the price or value of assets, but it also goes along with higher unemployment. The problem is that when prices go down economy-wide, firms are making less money because they're able to sell their products for a lower price. For this reason, they're going to end up laying off employees. There's another reason why unemployment goes down. Consumers, as they see unemployment going up, reduce their spending even more. But also, if you realize that we have deflation happening economy-wide and everything is getting cheaper, do you want to buy something now or do you want to wait a month, assuming that the price will fall even more? A lot of times people make that choice. So sales just end up stopping. There's a massive decline in purchasing when countries go through deflation because everybody is waiting for prices to continue to fall. And this creates an even bigger surge in firms laying off employees when no one's buying their goods. So this is a deflationary spiral where the decline in prices leads to unemployment, which leads to more fears of the future and also people waiting to buy things when they're cheaper, more unemployment, and on and on and on. So we're hopefully noticing that there's a big trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If inflation is high, unemployment is low. If unemployment is low, inflation is high. These are two different extremes, and we tend to move between these two in the economy. The next module will teach about the Phillips curve, which is actually a brand new economic model showing the trade-off between inflation and unemployment.